Our next topic is exclusionary factors. So a review of exclusionary factors can be found in Appendix H of your manual, as well as made reference to in pages 11 through 14. So on our next slide, you see the question, what sources of data can you consider related to exclusionary factors? In many cases, the team will not need to seek out additional sources of information in order to adequately answer the questions related to exclusionary factors, because within the evaluation process, particularly within the READ process, we've identified that these exclusionary factors are or are not relevant. So for example, a team might reference the home language survey to look at the exclusionary factor of English as a second language. They might refer to the student's attendance record in regards to provision of appropriate instruction. So there are several documents within the child's cumulative record that can be referenced prior to the evaluation process beginning in order to assess the relevancy of each of these exclusionary factors. But in the evaluation process, it is important that each of these questions are reviewed carefully by more than one team member, so that multiple persons can give input as to whether or not these factors are the primary causes for the student's underachievement. So let's move to the next slide, and here is just a visual showing you that 4 of these assurance statements within the eligibility recommendation relate to exclusionary factors. So you'll also notice that in addition to simply stating true or false, we also need to give a report and date. If this information is not explicitly stated within your psychological report, which many times it may not be, you do want to report on what is the direct source that you're getting the information to support your opinion of true or false. So with this first statement regarding appropriate instruction, you may be referencing the child's prior report cards, the child's attendance records, etc. The child's IET documentation would be a critical piece to report, especially when one of the goals of IET is to really ensure that the child is receiving appropriate instruction as well as intervention opportunities. So we'll move to the next slide here. Here's a new document for our teams. And this is called the Review of Appropriate Instruction. So there are evaluations in which the records are not sufficient for the team to reference in order to give an opinion on whether or not appropriate instruction and intervention opportunities were given, and give an opinion as to whether or not this factor is the primary reason for the child's underachievement. In these cases, we are recommending that an administrator review the available records, and you'll see examples of what that might look like. A good example of this would be if a child was referred for evaluation and they were coming from a homeschooling setting in which there were very few records provided. It can be difficult for the team to assess whether or not the learning opportunities were sufficient and not the primary cause of the child's underachievement. So the administrator in this example would review whatever records could become available to him or her, and then give opinions on whether or not these statements are true on this document. It's important to remember that this then is an opinion of one team member and should be considered by the IEP team, but does not necessarily determine eligibility in and of itself. It's simply another source of data for the team to consider from someone who is established as someone who is a professional and an expert in the curricular tools, what constitutes as appropriate instruction, as well as the Common Core state standards. So we'll move to the next slide, and here is Appendix H. This will look familiar to many of you. This is simply a worksheet to review what the exclusionary factors are relevant to SLD identification, and the team would want to look at any available data sources that could answer these questions and select yes or no as to whether or not that exclusionary factor is the primary cause for the student's underachievement. So just a couple differences that you will notice on this document is that autism spectrum disorders is an exclusionary factor under SLD determination. That is to say that when autism spectrum disorder is the primary reason or cause for the child's academic underachievement, that is a rule out factor for SLD. So there may be evaluations where you do identify an academic pattern of strength and weakness. However, when those patterns of weakness are primarily explained by autism spectrum disorders, a vision, hearing, motor impairment, or an emotional impairment, or a cognitive impairment, then all of those things are considered exclusionary factors. And when those impairments are considered to be the primary reason, again, then SLD eligibility would not be recommended.